A human farmer offered food. Aliens returned with a fleet, the simple act. The grease-stained walls of Murphy's last stop diner had seen better decades. Jake Martinez stood hunched over the industrial sink, scrubbing burnt residue from another batch of pans while rain hammered against the cracked windows. At 32, his calloused hands told the story of his fall from grace. Once, those same hands had designed fusion reactors for interstellar freighters. Now they cleaned dishes at the edge of human space. The diner sat on Highway 7, the main trucking route connecting the outer colonies to Earth's core systems. Murphy served as the last refueling stop before the lawless frontier regions where pirates and claim jumpers made their living. The clientele matched the atmosphere perfectly. Rough miners with dirt under their fingernails, long-haul truckers, hopped up on stimulants, and the occasional bounty hunter looking to disappear for a while. Jake had been working there for 8 months since losing his engineering position. The Meridian Corporation had downsized their entire R&D division, and with the economy in shambles, no one needed experienced engineers. He'd burned through his savings in 3 months of unemployment before taking the first job that would hire him. Murphy didn't ask questions and paid in cash. For Jake, that had to be enough. "Hey, Martinez." Murphy's gravelly voice cut through the kitchen noise. "Table 6 needs their order. Where's that lazy waitress?" Jake glanced through the service window at Table 6. 3 truckers who hadn't showered in a week sat arguing over their bill. Sarah, the evening waitress, had called in sick again, probably hungover. Jake dried his hands on his stained apron and grabbed the steaming plates. The storm outside had been building all day. Weather satellites showed it as a massive electrical disturbance moving in from the Kepler sector. These storms were common near the galactic rim, where space itself seemed angrier and less predictable. They played havoc with navigation systems and communication arrays. As Jake delivered the food, the lights flickered. The truckers barely noticed, too focused on their greasy meals and complaining about cargo deadlines. Jake returned to his dishes, listening to the wind howl around the building's aging structure. The diner had been built to last, constructed from reinforced concrete and steel to withstand the harsh conditions of frontier life. At exactly 11:47 p.m., something crashed in the woods behind Murphy's last stop. Jake felt it more than heard it. A deep vibration that rattled the plates in his hands and made the fluorescent lights swing on their chains. Murphy looked up from counting the day's meager receipts, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Probably just a tree coming down," Murphy muttered, but Jake could hear uncertainty in his voice. The crash came again, closer this time. Through the kitchen's back door, Jake could see an orange glow flickering between the trees. It wasn't the warm light of a campfire. It pulsed with an alien rhythm that made his engineering mind start cataloging possibilities. Electrical fire from downed power lines seemed most likely, but there were no power lines that deep in the woods. Jake set down the pan he'd been scrubbing and walked to the door. The rain had turned to sleet and ice pellets stung his face as he peered into the darkness. The orange glow flared brighter for a moment, and he caught a glimpse of twisted metal that definitely wasn't from any human vehicle he recognized. "I'm going to check it out," Jake called to Murphy. "Like hell you are," Murphy shot back. "Could be claim jumpers or worse. We mind our own business here." But Jake was already reaching for his coat. Something about that light called to him. Maybe it was his engineering curiosity, or maybe just the desperate need to do something meaningful after months of mindless dishwashing. He grabbed a flashlight and first aid kit from the emergency supplies and headed into the storm. The woods behind the diner were thick with native growth. Razor moss covered the tree trunks, and thorny undergrowth caught at his jeans as he made his way toward the crash site. The orange glow grew stronger with each step, and Jake began to make out the shape of something large and metallic, wedged between 2 massive trees. It was definitely a spacecraft, but unlike any design he'd seen in his years working with human vessels. The hull curved in organic patterns that seemed to flow like frozen water. Sections of it still glowed with internal heat, and sparks occasionally danced across its surface. The craft was roughly the size of a small cargo hauler, but its proportions were all wrong for human occupancy. Jake approached cautiously, his flashlight beam playing across the wreckage. Part of the hull had been torn open, revealing an interior filled with crystalline structures and softly pulsing lights. The technology was clearly alien, more advanced than anything humans had developed. A sound from inside the craft made Jake freeze. It was weak, almost like a whimper, but definitely organic. Someone or something was alive in there. Jake's rational mind screamed at him to turn around and walk away. First contact protocols existed for a reason. There were procedures, government agencies, and trained professionals who handled this kind of situation. A dishwasher from a backwater diner had no business getting involved with alien technology. But the sound came again, weaker this time, and Jake found himself moving forward. The opening in the hull was just large enough for him to squeeze through. Inside, the alien craft was surprisingly spacious. Bioluminescent panels provided dim lighting, and the air smelled like ozone and something floral he couldn't identify. Strange symbols glowed on crystalline surfaces that might have been control panels. Jake found them in what appeared to be the ship's main cabin. 3 beings unlike anything he'd ever imagined lay crumpled against the far wall. They were roughly humanoid, but taller and more slender than any human. Their skin had a translucent quality that showed the faint glow of their circulatory system beneath. Instead of hair, they had crystalline structures that sprouted from their scalps like living jewelry. All 3 were injured. Dark fluid that might have been blood seeped from various wounds, and their breathing was labored. The largest of the 3, who Jake assumed was their leader, had a particularly nasty gash across what looked like ribs. Their large, dark eyes tracked Jake's movement with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Jake knelt beside the injured leader and opened his first aid kit. The being flinched at first, then seemed to relax as Jake began cleaning the wound with gentle, practiced motions. The alien's blood was indeed dark, almost purple, but it clotted similarly to human blood when treated with standard coagulants. As Jake worked, the alien began to speak. The language was musical, filled with tones and harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't reproduce. But somehow Jake found he could understand the basic meaning. Whether this was due to some technological translation system or simple universal body language, he wasn't sure. The alien was grateful. That much was clear, and frightened. They spoke of hunters, of running, of worlds consumed by darkness. Jake gathered that they were refugees fleeing from something terrible, something that pursued them across the stars. Working by flashlight and emergency lighting from the ship, Jake did what he could for their injuries. The being's physiology was different enough that he had to improvise, but his engineering background helped him think systematically about problems and solutions. He fashioned splints from ship components for broken limbs and used his jacket to make bandages. When he was finished treating their wounds, the aliens still looked weak and exhausted. The leader gestured weakly toward what Jake assumed was their mouth, then pressed a hand to their stomach. The message was universal. They were hungry. Jake thought about the leftover food back at the diner. Murphy would be furious if he found out, but these beings needed help. Without hesitation, Jake squeezed back out of the ship and made his way through the storm to Murphy's last stop. The diner was empty now except for Murphy, who was finishing his closing routine. Jake slipped in through the back door and quickly gathered leftover soup, bread, and some protein bars from his own meager stash. He also grabbed a thermos of coffee and some bottled water. Murphy looked up as Jake headed for the door with his arms full of food. "What the hell are you doing, Martinez? There are people in the woods, they're hurt and hungry. People or vagrants. We don't run a charity here." Jake met Murphy's eyes steadily. "People who need help, that's all that matters." Murphy's face darkened. "That food costs money, food you're stealing from my inventory. Take it out of my pay." "Damn right I will. And if you're not back here by opening time tomorrow, don't bother coming back at all." Jake nodded and headed back into the storm. He'd worry about his job later. Right now, 3 injured beings needed his help. Back at the crashed ship, Jake found the aliens huddled together for warmth. Their crystalline hair structures had dimmed significantly, which he interpreted as a sign of their weakening condition. He offered them the food and was amazed at their reaction. The leader took a small sip of the soup and immediately straightened, their hair crystals brightening. They spoke rapidly to their companions, who also began to eat. Whatever nutritional needs they had, Human food seemed to satisfy them at least partially. As they ate, the leader began to tell Jake their story. Through a combination of basic language learning, gestures, and what Jake was becoming convinced was some form of telepathic communication, he learned that they called themselves Zilithians. They came from a cluster of worlds in the Andromeda Spiral, where their civilization had flourished for thousands of years. But something had come to their region of space, something that consumed entire worlds, leaving nothing but dead rock behind. The Zilithians called them the Void Hunters, parasitic beings that fed on life itself. World after world had fallen to them, and the few survivors had scattered across the galaxy as refugees. These 3 Zilithians had been fleeing for months when their ship was damaged by the storm. They'd crash-landed on this backwater world, expecting to die alone and forgotten. Instead, they'd found Jake. The leader, who Jake learned was named Keth, explained that their ship could be repaired if they could find the right components. Jake examined the damaged systems with his engineer's eye and realized that while the technology was alien, the basic principles were similar to human fusion drives. With some creative jury-rigging, it might be possible to get them flying again. Jake spent the rest of the night working on their ship. He used spare parts from his own collection back at his apartment, components he'd salvaged from various projects over the years. The Zilithian technology was remarkably adaptive, almost organic in how it integrated new elements into existing systems. By dawn, the ship's engines were humming again, not at full power but enough to get them off-world and to somewhere they could make proper repairs. The 3 Zilithians stood beside their restored vessel, their crystalline hair now blazing with health and gratitude. Keth approached Jake and placed something in his hands. It was a small device no bigger than a coin, that pulsed with the same gentle light as their hair crystals. Through their established communication, Keth explained that it was a quantum communicator, capable of reaching across vast distances of space. "If you ever need us," Keth said in words Jake somehow understood perfectly, "we will come." Jake watched their ship lift off into the brightening sky, its organic curves making it look more like a living thing than a machine. As it disappeared into the atmosphere, he walked back through the woods to Murphy's last stop, expecting to face his boss's anger and probably unemployment. He was right on both counts. Murphy was waiting for him with Jake's final paycheck and a stream of profanity about responsibility and theft. Jake didn't argue. He simply collected his belongings from his locker and walked out into the morning sun. As he loaded his few possessions into his old pickup truck, Jake looked down at the small device Keth had given him. It seemed impossibly advanced, a piece of technology worth more than everything he owned. But to Jake, its real value lay in what it represented. A connection across the vast emptiness of space. A reminder that kindness could bridge any gap between species. He had no idea that this simple act of compassion would soon reshape the destiny of not just his own species but the entire galaxy. In helping 3 desperate refugees, Jake Martinez had set in motion events that would challenge everything humans thought they knew about their place among the stars. For now, though, he was just an unemployed dishwasher with nowhere to go and very little money to his name. Jake started his truck and drove away from Murphy's last stop, not knowing that his life as an ordinary man was over, and his journey as an unlikely hero had just begun. The quantum communicator pulsed gently in his pocket, a tiny star carrying infinite possibilities. The unexpected return. 3 months had passed since Jake Martinez lost his job at Murphy's last stop, and life had become a daily struggle for survival. His old pickup truck served as both transportation and shelter, parked in different locations around the outer colonies to avoid drawing attention from local authorities. The truck's passenger seat held everything he owned: a few changes of clothes, his engineering tools, and the small quantum communicator that Keth had given him. Jake had tried finding work at various establishments across the frontier settlements. His engineering background should have been an asset, but the economic downturn meant that even skilled positions were scarce. Most employers took one look at his current living situation and decided he wasn't worth the risk. A homeless man with no fixed address wasn't exactly prime hiring material, regardless of his qualifications. He'd managed to survive by taking odd jobs wherever he could find them, repairing broken machinery for farmers, fixing communication arrays for small settlements, and occasionally helping miners with equipment problems. The work was sporadic and poorly paid, but it kept him fed and allowed him to buy fuel for his truck. On this particular evening, Jake had parked beside a small creek about 20 kilometers outside of Salvation Point, a mining town that barely qualified as a settlement. He'd spent the day fixing a broken water reclamation system for a local family, earning enough credits for a hot meal and some basic supplies. The quantum communicator sat on the dashboard beside him, its gentle pulsing providing the only light. Inside the truck's cabin, Jake often found himself staring at the device, wondering about the 3 Zilithians he'd helped. Had they made it to safety? Were they still running from the mysterious void hunters? Part of him hoped they had found peace somewhere among the stars. Another part longed for some sign that his sacrifice had meant something more than just losing his job and his home. The communicator had remained silent since Keth gave it to him. Jake wasn't even sure how it worked or if it was actually functional. For all he knew, it was simply a decorative token of gratitude. Beautiful, but ultimately useless. Still, he carried it with him everywhere, a tangible reminder of the night, when he'd chosen compassion over self-preservation. As Jake prepared to settle in for another night in his truck, the communicator suddenly flared with brilliant light. The gentle pulsing became rapid and intense, casting dancing shadows across the truck's interior. Jake picked up the device with trembling hands, his heart racing with anticipation and fear. The light stabilized, and suddenly Jake could hear Keith's musical voice speaking directly into his mind. The sensation was startling but not unpleasant, like hearing a song played on instruments he'd never encountered before. Jake Martinez of Earth, Keth's voice carried undertones of excitement and urgency. "We have returned as promised. Look to the sky." Jake scrambled out of his truck and looked up at the star-filled heavens. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then one by one, points of light began to move against the stellar background. Ships were dropping out of hyperspace, their forms becoming visible as they approached the planet's atmosphere. But these weren't just 3 refugees in a damaged vessel. Jake counted dozens of ships, then hundreds. The fleet that materialized in the skies above the outer colonies was vast and magnificent, representing technology far beyond anything humans had developed. The vessels shared the same organic, flowing design as Keth's small craft, but they ranged in size from fighters no bigger than shuttles to massive dreadnoughts that could have housed entire cities. Jake's communicator pulsed again, and Keth's voice returned. "We request permission to land a diplomatic vessel near your location. There is much we need to discuss." Jake looked around at the empty landscape surrounding his truck. He was alone beside a creek in the middle of nowhere, hardly the appropriate location for first contact between civilizations. But he activated the communicator and spoke aloud, hoping it would somehow transmit his voice back to the fleet. "Permission granted," he said, feeling slightly ridiculous. "But I should warn you, I'm not exactly an official representative of humanity." "You are the only representative we need," Keth replied. A single ship detached itself from the fleet and descended toward Jake's location. It was larger than the vessel he'd helped repair, roughly the size of a small passenger transport. The ship landed gracefully in the field beside the creek, its arrival so gentle that it barely disturbed the grass beneath it. A section of the hull flowed open like liquid metal, and Keth emerged, followed by several other Zilithians. Jake was amazed to see how much healthier they looked compared to their first meeting. Keth's crystalline hair blazed with vibrant colors, and their movements were strong and confident. The 2 companions who had been with them during the crash followed behind, along with several other Zilithians wearing what appeared to be formal diplomatic attire. Keth approached Jake with arms extended in a gesture of greeting. When they spoke, Jake found that the communication barrier had somehow dissolved completely. Whether through advanced translation technology or some form of telepathic link, he could understand every word perfectly. "Jake Martinez," Keth said, their voice filled with warmth and gratitude. "You cannot imagine how many light years we have traveled to find you again." "I'm glad you're safe," Jake replied, still struggling to process the surreal situation. But, I have to ask, why are you here? And why did you bring such a large fleet? Keth's expression became serious. We brought our fleet because of what you showed us 3 months ago. Your actions that night changed everything for our people. One of the other Zilithians stepped forward, an elderly individual whose crystalline hair had taken on a silver hue with age. Keth gestured respectfully toward them. This is Elder Voss, the spiritual leader of our remaining colonies. They wish to meet you personally. Elder Voss studied Jake with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of centuries. When they spoke, their voice carried undertones of deep wisdom and barely contained emotion. Young human, do you understand what your kindness meant to us that night? Jake shrugged uncomfortably. I just did what anyone would do. You were hurt and hungry. No, Elder Voss said firmly. What you did was extraordinary. Let me tell you why. The elder gestured toward the starlit sky, and suddenly Jake could see images forming in the air around them. Holographic displays showed worlds covered in crystal cities, vast gardens that stretched across continents, and millions of Zilithians living in harmony with their environment. This was our civilization, Elder Voss explained. For over 5,000 years, we built something beautiful among the stars. We were philosophers, artists, and scientists. We believed in the inherent goodness of life and the possibility of peaceful coexistence with all sentient beings. The images changed, showing the same worlds shrouded in darkness. The crystal cities were broken and empty, the gardens withered and dead. Strange, shadowy forms moved across the devastated landscapes like living nightmares. Then the Void Hunters came, Elder Voss continued. At first we tried to communicate with them to understand what they wanted. But they consumed everything in their path. Entire worlds were stripped of life, leaving nothing but empty shells behind. We fought back, of course, but our weapons were designed for defense, not the kind of war they brought to us. More images appeared, showing massive space battles between elegant Zilithian vessels and the twisted organic ships of their enemies. The Zilithians were clearly outmatched, their beautiful ships being overwhelmed by sheer numbers and savage tactics. We became refugees in our own galaxy, Elder Voss said. We scattered, broken, and filled with despair. Many of our people began to believe that the universe itself was fundamentally cruel, that kindness was a luxury we could no longer afford. Some suggested that we should become like our enemies, ruthless and consumed with survival at any cost. Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he began to understand the implications of what he was hearing. That night when you found Keth and the others, Elder Voss continued, our people were on the verge of losing something far more precious than our worlds. We were about to lose our souls. The debate in our remaining colonies had become bitter. Should we abandon our principles and become monsters to fight monsters? Or should we accept extinction with our honor intact? Keth stepped forward, their voice filled with emotion. Then I returned with news of a human who gave food to strangers without asking for anything in return. A being who risked his livelihood to help refugees he'd never seen before and might never see again. You reminded us why we fight, Jake. Not just to survive, but to protect the possibility of goodness in the universe. Elder Voss nodded approvingly. Your simple act of compassion saved more than 3 lives that night. It saved the soul of our entire civilization. When word spread through our colonies about what you had done, it reignited hope in millions of hearts that had grown cold with despair. Jake stared at the assembled Zilithians, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were telling him. But I'm nobody special, he protested. I'm just an unemployed engineer living in his truck. What you're describing, it's too big for someone like me. That is precisely why it matters so much, Elder Voss replied. You didn't help us because you were ordered to, or because you had some grand destiny to fulfill. You helped us because it was the right thing to do. That kind of moral courage is rarer than you might think. Keth moved closer to Jake, their expression intense. We have spent these past months regrouping, rebuilding our forces, and preparing for a final confrontation with the Void Hunters. But we realized we were still missing something crucial. We were still thinking like warriors instead of the people we used to be. That's why we came back for you, another Zilithian added. We need someone who can remind us how to see beyond the war, how to find solutions that don't require us to become the very thing we're fighting against. Jake looked up at the massive fleet hanging in the sky above them. You want me to join your war? We want you to help us end it, Elder Voss corrected. Not through superior firepower or better tactics, but through the kind of insight that only comes from a heart that refuses to give up on the possibility of peace. The weight of their request settled on Jake like a physical burden. 3 months ago, he'd been washing dishes in a rundown diner. Now an alien civilization was asking him to help save the galaxy. It seemed impossible, absurd even. But as he looked at the faces around him, Jake saw something that made his decision easier. In their eyes, he saw the same desperate hope he'd seen in Keth's gaze that stormy night in the woods. They weren't asking him to be a general or a diplomat or some kind of superhero. They were asking him to be exactly what he'd always been, a decent human being who chose kindness even when it cost him something. What exactly would you need me to do? Jake asked. Keth's crystalline hair flared with excitement. Help us think differently about our enemy. Help us find a way to stop the Void Hunters without losing ourselves in the process. Be our conscience when the temptation for revenge grows too strong. Jake thought about his life over the past 3 months. The loneliness, the constant worry about where his next meal would come from, the gradual erosion of hope that had begun to eat away at his spirit. He had nothing left to lose and potentially everything to gain. More importantly, these people needed him. Not because he was particularly skilled or special, but because he represented something they were afraid of losing. If his presence could help them hold on to their principles while fighting for survival, then maybe his own struggles would finally have meaning. All right, Jake said, his voice growing stronger with conviction. I'll come with you. But I need to know what we're really up against. Elder Voss smiled for the first time since the conversation began. Then come aboard our ship, Jake Martinez of Earth. It's time you learned the true nature of the Void Hunters and why your species may hold the key to defeating them. As Jake walked toward the Zilithian vessel, the quantum communicator in his pocket pulsed with warm light. Behind him, his old pickup truck sat abandoned beside the creek, a relic of his former life. Ahead lay an adventure among the stars that would test not just his courage, but his fundamental beliefs about the nature of good and evil. Jake didn't know it yet, but the greatest challenge wouldn't be facing an alien enemy across the vastness of space. It would be maintaining his humanity in the face of horrors that could break even the strongest spirit, and finding a path to victory that didn't require him to become the very monster he was fighting against. The universe was about to discover what happened when human compassion met galactic warfare, and the results would surprise everyone involved, including Jake himself. The human solution. The command deck of the Zilithian flagship Harmony's Dawn was unlike any human military vessel Jake had ever seen. Instead of harsh metal surfaces and blinking control panels, the bridge resembled a living garden. Crystalline formations grew from organic walls, their surfaces displaying tactical information in flowing patterns of light. The air smelled of ozone and something floral that reminded Jake of spring rain. Jake stood beside Elder Voss and Keth, watching as the fleet prepared for what everyone hoped would be the final battle with the Void Hunters. Through the great viewing portal that dominated the forward wall, he could see a star system under siege. 3 inhabited worlds hung in space like dying embers, their surfaces covered with the dark spread of Void Hunter infestation. It had been 2 weeks since Jake joined the Zilithian fleet, and in that time he'd learned more about the enemy than he'd ever wanted to know. The Void Hunters weren't just parasites or mindless destroyers. They were something far worse, a species driven by an endless, insatiable hunger that could never be satisfied. The evacuation ships from Kepler-7 have reached minimum safe distance, reported Commander Thys from the tactical station. Her crystalline hair flickered with patterns of orange and red, indicating high stress levels. But they're reporting that the Void Hunters are accelerating their consumption rate. The planet's biosphere will be completely stripped within 6 hours. Elder Voss nodded grimly. And the other worlds? Kepler-4 has perhaps 2 days remaining. Kepler-9 may last a week if we're fortunate. Jake studied the tactical displays, trying to make sense of the alien symbology. Over the past 2 weeks, he'd been given access to the Zilithians' complete database on the Void Hunters. What he'd learned had given him nightmares. The Void Hunters appeared to be a collective organism, individual units connected by some form of hive consciousness. They consumed organic matter with terrifying efficiency, breaking down everything, from grass to sentient beings, and converting it into more of themselves. Wherever they passed, they left behind worlds that were literally dead, stripped of every molecule of life down to the bacterial level. Traditional warfare had proven useless against them. The Void Hunters adapted to every weapon, every tactic, every strategy with frightening speed. Worse, they seemed to learn from each encounter, becoming more efficient killers with each battle. Admiral Corrin's strike force is requesting permission to begin the assault, Commander Thys reported. All ships are in position for the final push. Jake looked at the deployment screens showing hundreds of Zilithian vessels arranged in perfect formation around the infected system. It was the largest fleet the refugees had been able to assemble, representing the combined naval power of dozens of surviving colonies. If this attack failed, there might not be enough ships left for another attempt. Jake, Keth said quietly, do you have any final insights before we begin? Jake had spent the voyage studying every piece of data the Zilithians had collected about their enemy. Battle recordings, biological samples, intercepts of their communications, everything. He'd approached the problem like an engineering challenge, looking for patterns and weaknesses that might have been overlooked. What he'd found troubled him deeply. I need to see the communication intercepts again, Jake said. The ones from the early encounters. Keth activated a display that showed cryptic symbols and waveforms. These were fragments of Void Hunter transmissions that Zilithian intelligence had managed to decode over the years. Most appeared to be tactical communications, but Jake had been focusing on something else entirely. There, Jake pointed to a specific section. This pattern appears in over 60% of their early transmissions, but it disappears completely after the 3rd year of the war. Elder Voss leaned closer to examine the data. What do you think it means? I think it was a distress call, Jake said quietly. I think the Void Hunters were trying to ask for help. The bridge fell silent except for the soft humming of the ship's systems. Jake could feel every eye on him as he continued his explanation. Look at the progression of their behavior over time. In the early encounters, they consumed only what they needed for immediate survival. Their attacks were desperate, but limited. It wasn't until after year 3 that they began the total planetary consumption we see now. Commander Thys's crystalline hair flashed with skeptical orange. You're suggesting the Void Hunters weren't always mindless destroyers? I'm suggesting they're not mindless at all, Jake replied. I think they're starving. Not just hungry, but dying of starvation on a species-wide level. Every action they take is driven by that desperation. Elder Voss studied the tactical displays with new interest. Even if that were true, how would it help us? We can't negotiate with beings that consume sentient life. Jake turned to face the assembled command staff. What if we could feed them? The Tao suggestion sent ripples of shock through the bridge. Several officers began speaking at once, their voices mixing into a chorus of disbelief and outrage. Feed them, Commander Thys demanded. They've consumed billions of lives. You want us to reward genocide? I want us to stop it, Jake replied firmly. Every military solution you've tried has failed. Maybe it's time to try something else. Keth moved closer to Jake, their expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. What exactly are you proposing? Jake activated the tactical display and began highlighting specific areas of the infected system. Look at their behavior patterns. The Void Hunters don't just consume randomly. They target high-energy biological compounds first, then work their way down to less nutritious sources. It's the behavior of a species facing famine. He pulled up detailed scans of the infected worlds. See these areas they've left untouched? Rocky regions with minimal organic content. They're not wasting energy on low-yield targets. That's not the behavior of mindless monsters. It's the behavior of desperate beings trying to maximize their caloric intake. Elder Voss was beginning to look intrigued despite himself. You're talking about feeding an entire species. The quantity of organic matter required would be enormous. Not if we're smart about it, Jake replied. He began calling up engineering schematics, designs that had been forming in his mind over the past several days. We don't need to feed them directly. We need to create a sustainable food source that can meet their long-term needs. The schematics showed massive structures that looked like crystalline asteroids. Jake explained his concept with growing excitement, his engineering background finally finding a purpose worthy of his skills. Synthetic biology platforms, he said. Essentially, we create artificial worlds designed specifically for rapid organic production. High-energy algae, synthetic proteins, everything a starving species would need to survive without consuming other sentient beings. Commander Theiss remained skeptical. The resources required to build such platforms would be staggering. And what guarantee do we have that it would work? No guarantee, Jake admitted. But consider the alternative. Your current plan involves fighting the Void Hunters until one side or the other is completely extinct. Even if you win, how many more worlds will be consumed in the process? How many more innocents will die? The bridge fell silent as the assembled Zilithians considered his words. Jake could see the internal struggle playing out in their expressions. They were a peaceful people, forced to become warriors, and the transformation had cost them dearly. There's another problem, Elder Voss said. Finally, even if we could build these food platforms, how would we communicate our intentions to the Void Hunters? Every attempt at contact has resulted in immediate attack. Jake smiled for the first time in days. We don't communicate with words. We communicate with actions. He turned to the tactical display and began sketching out a new plan, one that would require more courage than any military assault. We build one prototype platform and deliver it directly to the heart of their infestation. We make ourselves vulnerable, show them that we're not a threat. If I'm right about their motivations, they'll understand what we're offering. And if you're wrong? Commander Theiss asked. Jake met her gaze steadily. Then we'll have died trying to save lives instead of take them. That has to count for something. Elder Voss was quiet for a long moment, his ancient eyes studying Jake with an intensity that made the human feel transparent. Finally, the elder spoke. Commander Theiss, delay the assault. Redirect our engineering ships to begin construction of Jake's food platform. Elder Voss, with respect, this is madness, Theiss protested. We're talking about walking into the teeth of the enemy unarmed. We're talking about doing something our enemies won't expect, Elder Voss replied, something they may not know how to counter because they've never encountered it before. Unconditional compassion. The next 48 hours saw the most frantic construction effort in Zilithian history. Using a combination of their advanced biotechnology and Jake's engineering innovations, they created a prototype food platform the size of a small moon. The structure was designed to produce massive quantities of high-energy organic compounds using nothing but starlight and raw materials from asteroid fields. Jake worked alongside Zilithian engineers, his human perspective providing crucial insights into efficient design. The aliens' technology was far more advanced than anything humans had developed, but they approached problems with a different mindset. Where Zilithians sought elegant, harmonious solutions, Jake focused on practical efficiency. The fusion of their approaches created something revolutionary. The food platform could produce enough nutrition to sustain millions of beings, while reproducing itself exponentially. If the concept worked, they could seed the galaxy with these structures, ending hunger on a cosmic scale. But first, they had to survive the delivery. Jake insisted on piloting the transport ship himself. It was his plan, his responsibility, and he refused to ask others to take risks he wouldn't accept. Elder Voss and Keth accompanied him, along with a small crew of volunteers who believed in the mission despite its apparent insanity. As their ship approached the heart of the Void Hunter infestation, Jake felt his hands trembling on the controls. Through the viewports, he could see the enemy in their natural environment for the first time. The Void Hunters were unlike anything he had imagined. They moved through space like living shadows, their forms shifting and flowing as if they were made of liquid darkness. Their ships, if they could be called ships, looked more like massive organisms with hulls of chitinous black material. "They're detecting us," reported the sensor operator. "Multiple vessels converging on our position." "Maintain course," Jake said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Lower all shields and power down weapons." "Jake," Keth said urgently, "they're preparing to fire." Through the viewport, Jake could see the Void Hunter vessels positioning themselves for attack. Energy was building along their organic hulls, preparing to unleash the same devastating force that had consumed countless worlds. "Release the platform," Jake ordered. The massive food production structure separated from their ship and began to activate. Immediately, it started converting nearby space debris into organic compounds, its bioluminescent surface pulsing with the rhythm of artificial life. For a moment, nothing happened. The Void Hunter vessels maintained their attack positions while their apparent target drifted helplessly before them. Jake held his breath, knowing that the next few seconds would determine the fate of multiple civilizations. Then something unexpected occurred. The energy buildup along the Void Hunter ships began to dissipate. Their formation broke as individual vessels moved closer to examine the food platform. Jake watched in amazement as the first Void Hunter made contact with the structure. Instead of consuming it, they began to interface with its systems. Through the ship's sensors, Jake could observe data streams flowing between the aliens and the platform. They were learning how it worked, understanding what it offered. "They're not attacking," Keth whispered in amazement. More Void Hunter vessels arrived, and Jake could see them beginning to construct similar structures using the platform as a template. Their biotechnology was adapting the design, improving it, making it more efficient. Suddenly, the ship's communication systems activated. A signal was coming through on frequencies Jake had never heard before, but somehow he could understand it perfectly. The voice that spoke was unlike anything human or Zelithian, filled with harmonics that suggested vast intelligence and bottomless sorrow. "You offer sustenance without conquest?" the voice asked, each word seeming to carry the weight of eons. Jake activated the communication system and spoke directly to the entity. "We offer a chance to end the hunger. No more worlds need to die. We remember when we grew, instead of consuming," the voice replied. "Before the great dying, we were gardeners of life, not devourers of it." Through the communication link, Jake began to see images, a civilization of beings who had once transformed barren worlds into gardens. They had been farmers on a galactic scale, nurturing life wherever they went. But something had gone wrong, a plague or ecological disaster that destroyed their food sources and left them facing extinction. "You were never monsters," Jake realized. "You were victims. We became what we feared most to survive," the Void Hunter entity said. "We consumed others to avoid consuming ourselves. Each world we devoured was an act of desperation, not malice." Jake felt tears running down his cheeks as he understood the true tragedy of the situation. The Void Hunters weren't evil invaders, but refugees driven to horrific acts by starvation and despair. They had become the very thing they once fought against, and the shame of it had driven them to the brink of madness. "It doesn't have to continue," Jake said. "We can build enough food platforms to sustain your entire species. You can return to what you once were. The consumed worlds, the billions of lives." The entity's voice was filled with anguish. "How can such acts be forgiven?" Elder Voss activated his own communication channel, his ancient voice filled with compassion. "By ensuring they never happen again. By choosing to nurture life instead of consuming it. By remembering who you were before desperation changed you." Over the following hours, Jake watched in wonder as the greatest war in galactic history came to an end, not through victory or defeat, but through understanding. The Void Hunters began converting their war fleets into construction vessels, working alongside the Zelithians to build food platforms throughout the infected systems. The consumed worlds could never be restored, But new life began to flourish as the former destroyers channeled their incredible biotechnology toward creation instead of consumption. Planets that had been stripped bare began to show the first signs of new ecosystems as the reformed Void Hunters seeded them with carefully designed organisms. Jake found himself serving as a liaison between the species, helping to coordinate the massive reconstruction effort. His background in engineering proved invaluable, as they developed new technologies that combined the best aspects of human innovation, Zilithian harmony, and the reformed Void Hunters' biological mastery. Months passed before Jake realized that he had become something he never expected: a diplomat, an architect of peace, a bridge between species that had once been locked in mortal combat. The quantum communicator that had started it all now served as the key component in a galactic communication network that kept the peace. As he stood on the observation deck of the newly constructed Unity Station, watching ships from dozens of species working together to heal wounded worlds, Jake reflected on how profoundly his life had changed. He had gone from washing dishes in a frontier diner to helping reshape the destiny of the galaxy. But the most important change wasn't in his circumstances. It was in his understanding of what it meant to be human. Humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their adaptability or even their courage. It was their refusal to give up on the possibility that even the most terrible enemies might be suffering beings in need of compassion. Keth approached from behind, their crystalline hair now displaying patterns of deep contentment. The food production platforms in the Andromeda sector are ahead of schedule. The former Void Hunters are proving to be remarkably efficient gardeners, Jake smiled. They always were. They just forgot for a while. And the refugee resettlement program? Better than expected. It turns out that beings who know what it's like to be hungry are very good at making sure others never experience that suffering. Keth stood beside Jake at the observation window, both of them watching as a massive bioship worked to replant the devastated surface of a nearby world. The ship's organic hull pulsed with gentle light as it seeded the barren ground with new life. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stopped to help us that night? Keth asked. Jake considered the question. Every day. But I think someone would have. Maybe not me, maybe not that night. But eventually someone would have chosen compassion over fear. That's what sentient beings do when they're at their best. Is that what makes humans special? Your optimism? Jake shook his head. I don't think humans are special at all. I think every species has individuals who choose kindness when it would be easier to choose cruelty. We just got lucky that I was the one who found you first. As if to prove his point, a group of young beings from multiple species ran past the observation deck, their laughter echoing through the station's corridors. Among them were human children from the outer colonies, young Zilithians with their characteristic crystalline hair, and remarkably small beings who appeared to be juvenile Void Hunters, their dark forms shimmering with playful bioluminescence. The next generation won't even remember the war, Keth observed. Good, Jake replied. Let them grow up in a universe where feeding the hungry is more important than defeating the enemy. The quantum communicator in Jake's pocket pulsed gently, now serving as part of the network that connected thousands of worlds in peaceful cooperation. He had kept it as a reminder of how small actions could have infinite consequences, how a simple choice to share food with strangers could literally change the course of history. Jake Martinez had started his journey as a dishwasher, who lost his job for showing kindness to aliens. He ended it as living proof that the greatest victories weren't won through superior firepower or brilliant tactics, but through the simple recognition that every sentient being, no matter how different or frightening, deserved compassion. In the end, that was the most human thing of all, the stubborn refusal to give up on the possibility of redemption, even for those who seemed beyond saving. And in a galaxy that had nearly torn itself apart through fear and misunderstanding, that refusal had made all the difference.